And welcome to the first lecture for CRIM 11007, Justice, Ends and Means. I'm Scott Beattie, I'm the lecturer academic for this particular subject, and in this unit, this module, we're going to introduce what we're going to talk about this term and look at some of the foundation concepts in our exploration of justice. So before we get started, this unit uses the flipped classroom method, which means that all the lectures are recorded beforehand to allow you to prepare before coming along to workshops, and then the workshops focus on actual practical exercises and actual challenges for you to work through some of the concepts and ideas in small groups around the topics that are raised each week. Now, a couple of people have asked me what happens if you can't make those times. Well, are other workshops recorded? Well, the large group parts of the workshop where we're all together do get recorded, but of course the small group discussions don't. So to complete the workshop, you will need to do those particular parts yourself, ideally with other students in the course. And I think if you log on to Teams, you'll probably find other students who are in the same boat, and you can find a study group that you can meet at a time that's appropriate for all of you. That's been very successful in the past. Or you can, if you can't find other students to work through these modules with you, then you can probably find others, family members, rope in friends to work through them. But this is a subject that's founded on the idea of active learning by doing, not just sitting here and listening to me talk. Speaking of which, these recorded lectures each week, for those of you who are doing this subject and those who've just chanced upon them on YouTube, they do connect to the weekly materials. There's a version of my notes from these published each week in the student learning management system, and I'll put a public archive of them as well. Again, just in case someone happens to chance upon these on YouTube and is curious about these things, so and wants to know more about them. So I'll put a link in below in the description area if you're interested in following those up, and particularly if you're after particular citations or spellings or so on. You may also want to use the audio versions of these lectures, because honestly there's nothing exciting happening visually except me sitting here and talking to you. So I'll also upload some audio versions as an alternative, so you can listen to it in the car or doing the washing up or whatever. I don't use PowerPoint. There's been a substantial amount of research on why PowerPoint is a very bad idea in an educational setting. I'm not going to bore you all with the details of it now. If you are curious, I'm happy to have a chat about the reasons, but basically PowerPoint is a very bad thing to use in learning. And I guess also in meetings of any of us who've been bored by death by PowerPoint in the past. So no, I don't create PowerPoints. And one of the reasons of having the materials available in doc format is so you can make your own notes, and you can modify what's there. You can take things out, simplify it, make summaries, add in additional things that we might talk about from week to week that are new to the notes. It's yours to mess around with and do what you like with it, except for kind of steal them or republish them or whatever. All right, so the theme of this week and each of the weeks in this subject will move through a different way of thinking about justice, because there are so many different ways and they lead to so many different conclusions. This week we're going to touch on some of the basic ideas of justice, and to also look at the links between our individual identity and sense of place that are really closely linked to our sense of justice and injustice. And I guess one of the first initial observations is that justice is not something we tend to feel or experience as a positive thing, but we certainly know about it when we have a sense of injustice. So that's something that will that we will return to throughout the term. But it is interesting that when we're content, we never sit around and go, oh, I feel like justice is served at the moment. I feel a really contented sense of justice. But if we feel we're hard done by, if we feel that things are unfair, we very, very, very much feel that sense of injustice. And we feel it in a particular, very much personal, embodied way. And one of the contradictions of trying to study something like justice is that we often talk about it in very intellectual, abstract kind of terms, like justice is this thing that's out there somewhere that's not linked to people or places or bodies. But in fact, justice is something that is deeply embodied, is something that is very much about who we are and where we are. And we'll see that conflict from time to time, because often theorists will try and establish a broad, universal definition of justice, which means this or that or the other, and pretend that it doesn't depend on your background and your beliefs. And there are lots of things that, you know, we tend to agree on across cultures and backgrounds around feelings about harming others or depriving others, being unjust. But there are also other things that it very much differs. And I remember, unfortunately, catching an episode of My Super Sweet 16 many years ago. I think I was in an airport and had no control over it, or a dentist's, I don't know. And there was the teenager in that who was given a car, given an Audi for her birthday, and it was the wrong colour. And you've never quite seen anyone have such a meltdown about the wrongs and injustices of the world, that the extremely expensive car her parents bought her for her 16th birthday was the wrong colour. So I don't doubt that she very much felt those open emotions, very much felt that embodied experience of how unfair the world is. But you can also see how other people who face much more severe injustice from day to day, can we judge it objectively? I don't know. But people who maybe we could say objectively face starvation and deprivation and racism and disadvantage, who don't feel quite so extremely about the injustice they're facing, that they're more accepting of it. So in any case, that's an extreme example, but our sense of justice and injustice is about where we are and who we are. And I want to return to that theme again throughout the course and take us away from this sort of hypothetical intellectual pursuit of justice being this thing that we can define in words, to thinking about justice as something that we experience, and then try to use words to define that experience in a way that we can talk to others about it. I mean, that's why we use words. It's why we use theories, is to try and find common ground with others to explain and explore these things that we feel, and to explain what that means in terms of the action that we take. But unfortunately, that can often get lost in the process, and it can often be a situation where we're talking about a lot of old dead philosophers in terms of what they think, and it all can seem very abstract, and it certainly isn't. Now, my anticipation is that most of the people who are taking this course are working in and around the justice profession. They're people who are working, who are planning to work in a field where they're going to bump into the justice profession in some way or another. Or they may even be working within the justice profession, because there's a lot of people that are not lawyers who work in the justice profession. So one of the things we also return to is that the idea of the institution of justice, particularly the law, and how that reflects what we think of as justice in a culture. So my original degree was in law, and I had to learn a lot of this stuff the hard way. So I'm hoping to give you a bit of some shortcuts here to understanding what the law is, the way in which it operates, and what is that relationship between law and justice, because it's not one way or the other. I mean, it's one thing to say that law equals justice, which it certainly doesn't, but then if you're cynical and say that law is not about justice, it's all about other things, then you also miss the opportunity to use those institutions as a mode of social change. So try and take a balanced look at this all the way through. And we're going to take a few deep dives into the way in which law looks at problems and solves problems. Not that I'm preparing any of you guys to be lawyers. Some of you may decide later on that this is interesting and you go on to study law. But I think having a practical understanding of how law operates, the way in which law sees problems, the way in which law solves problems, is extremely useful for people who are working alongside the legal and justice professions, because it gives you a much clearer idea of what they do. And lawyers are good at sort of, not explaining things to lay people and being fairly opaque about that black box around law and how it operates and how it gets to the point of deciding things that it does. So yes, this unit will also function as a little bit of an introduction to law sort of course, introduction to law for non-lawyers. And again, I hope that what we'll be doing, what I've been trying to do, is to make it really interesting and applied, and not deal with a lot of high-level definitional stuff, but actually talk about what actually happens in lawmaking, what happens in the interpretation of laws, what the rules are around that, and how we can lead, how the outcomes are achieved. Because I don't think it'll be a surprise to you that the media representation of law is not very much like what happens actually within the law. And certainly legal cases are not won and lost by, handsome and attractive lawyers striding back and forth and making large moral speeches. The technical work of law is quite different to that. So I hope that's something you'll find interesting. Or even if you don't find it interesting now, that in the actual practical use of it, that you'll find it useful and applicable to your career as you try and figure out why do lawyers think the way they do, why do they do the things they do. All right, so let's get onto some basic foundations. In the guide, there's a series of terms I want you to have a bit of a think about in your own time, and to write down just a sentence or so about what you think these things mean. And the idea of this is so that you can return to it at the end of the term and look at how your ideas have changed and evolved over time. This is always a useful thing to do, because sometimes you get to the end of a term and you go, well, I've finished that, that's a unit, it's done, and you don't really get a sense of the journey and what you've achieved. So I think it's good to be able to go back and go, okay, that's changed, or I still believe that, or I've had a different way of thinking. So it's useful to do this, and those terms are justice, law, democracy, fairness, equality, social justice, and advocacy. And again, we'll come back to, we'll be exploring those things throughout the term more, but I'm really interested in you being able to just come up with what you think those things are right now. Now, in terms of some other basic terms, there's a very useful breakdown of different ethical approaches that come from the Greek philosophers that are going to underlie a lot of what we do this term, and in fact are embedded in the subject, the title of the subject. And let's talk those through now. These are the terms teleology, deontology, and virtue theory. And these are the three foundational ways of thinking about justice that we get from various Greek philosophers, leading up to Aristotle, who is probably the most well-known philosopher around justice theory. So, teleology, what's that about? That means we judge the good of something by the ends that it achieves. We compare that to deontology. Deontology is the means are just as important as the ends. So a teleologist would say it's okay to make an omelette by breaking some eggs. A deontologist would say you can't make moral or ethical shortcuts along the way. You have to achieve the right ends using the right means. And we see this division in debates all the way through about, ends versus means. The third one is an interesting one, which is virtue theory, which takes another step of stringency above the deontological approach, which holds that you also have to do things for the right reasons. It's not enough that you do the right things in the right way, but you also have to do them for the right reasons. You have to be virtuous. You have to believe in that. That's a philosophical approach which fell out of favour, particularly in the modern era, where it was seen as very impractical. And people basically said, well, as long as we can have the right means and the right ends and the right means, let's not quibble over whether people are doing for selfish reasons. And in fact, philosophers like Nietzsche and nihilists really believe that no one does everything for virtuous reasons. Even if you do something that's just really selfless and generous, you're doing that because of the nice feeling it gives you for being a generous person, the reputation that it gives you for being, a great, generous, charitable person. Nihilists are such cynics. But we've seen a return, and I'm seeing in philosophy and in politics, a return to that idea of virtue theory about saying, just having someone who, donates money to charity and they do all the right things, it isn't enough. That we do need to start talking about people, about cultivating virtues in people and making better people. And it seems in some ways a bit sort of naive to expect, particularly if you're a nihilist, it seems a little naive to expect people to be great people on part of everything else. But there's also an area of thought where people are saying, well, why not? What does it mean about our culture that we've given up on trying to produce great people? Shouldn't we hold higher standards or expectations or goals where we can try and have people who do the right things for the right reasons? Anyway, another term that I want to introduce that sort of fits sideways into that is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is usually summarized as the greatest good for the greatest many. And this is really usually a teleological sort of concern, and often it is used to justify some harm being done for the minority in charge of the majority. So utilitarianism is often used as an economic or a neoliberal social policy, where it's like, as long as most people are better off, that's okay if some people aren't. And again, I think that's a good example of where that distinction between utilitarianism and between teleology and deontology becomes very important. Whenever someone's a loser on a particular decision or a particular policy, is that justified? Is that justified that we pick a group of people and say, well, you're going to be worse off in order for everyone else to be better off? So another term that we use that ties into those ideas is the slippery slope. The kind of, once you start making those sort of concessions, those teleological decisions, and particularly on a policy level where it's all very remote, you're not actually looking at the people who are going to suffer as a result of a decision that you make, that it becomes much easier to make more of those decisions on that basis. No. If you believe that raising, here's a contemporary example, raising interest rates is good for the overall economy and will therefore be good for everyone else, and that's therefore worth the sacrifice of the people who are going to struggle, who are going to lose their houses because of that interest rate rise, then we are in that conundrum that deontological ethicists would talk about in terms of that slippery slope. If you're a banker or a politician or an economist, and you don't actually have to see that family collapse, lose their house, people lose their jobs, the family fall apart, when that remains an abstraction to you, it's much easier to be able to make those kinds of decisions than when they're real to you. And again, here we're back to virtue theory as well, what a virtue theorist would say about that. All right, so back onto how this all fits together to justice. Here are three different positions on personal ethics that have major impacts on the way in which you see justice and the justice system operating. Do you think that it's best if justice is served for most people, even if some people face injustice? Do you think justice is something that where the ends justify the means, or do the means have to be, legitimate as well? Do you think that people in the justice system should be in there for the right reasons rather than cynical reasons for self-advancement? Or is that, again, too high a standard to set to people? Can we not really expect people to be virtuous because we're all kind of postmodern cynicists who believe that basically the rest of society are terrible people? Okay. We also have I want to talk a little bit about the connection between justice and equality. There's much more to justice than just equality, but it is one of the areas in which our sense of justice is very much, or a sense of injustice is very much alerted when we feel the unfairness of inequality, of being treated differently. And not treated differently in a good way, being treated differently in a way where you feel as though you are disadvantaged as compared to others. And this is something I think is an embodied sensation that goes back to childhood. People who have siblings definitely know the personal feeling of injustice when someone gets something that you don't. But also, even without siblings, you see people in society who have more than you. And that feeling of, is feeling of unfairness, that feeling of inequality, of being treated differently. Or you have someone who experiences a form of discrimination and you've treated as a lesser person. Because of that, you get a very much acute sense of embodied injustice, because there's something about your body that is causing others, well, it's not that is allowing others, I shouldn't have said causing, is allowing others to discriminate against you on the basis of something usually physical about your body. Of course, we as human beings find new ways to discriminate against people on all sorts of grounds, not just what they look like, so it's not limited to that. So law has a strong role in trying to protect equality. Law has a role, and we'll talk about this next week in more depth when we look at the idea of rule of law. Law is seen as the custodian of rights in society, the protector of rights, leaving aside for a moment the question of how well it actually achieves that. But that is the function of law. And we have this idea of equality before the law. The problem is, what does equality actually mean when it boils down to it? And the law often uses a concept of what we call formal equality, which is everyone, there's no barriers to access to the law. There's no barrier that says people with blue eyes can't appear in court and bring cases in court, for instance. There's no formal discrimination. However, of course, it costs money to retain lawyers. It costs money to bring cases in court. And there's a great quote from Anatole France, that in its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal loaves of bread. Pointing out the fact that, of course, the rich don't need to do any of those things. Someone else also said the courts of England are like the Ritz Hotel, open to all. And we get across this idea that there's formal equality, which is not having rules that are barriers for people to do things, but there's also substantive equality, which is a system which actually allows a level playing field, actually allows people's access. So that's, I think, a very useful distinction to keep in mind as a foundation idea when throughout this subject, when we look at those ideas. When someone says about equality, are we talking about formal equality, which is just not having prejudicial rules, not having barriers, treating people as equal in a formal way according to the rules, and substantive equality, where we actually look at the fact that some people need an additional boost, an additional help in able to achieve equality. And a classic, not the only example, but a classic example of that, of course, is wealth and resources. The very few people have the resources to have access to the courts, to have access to even, seek out legal advice. And that is getting worse. And that's gotten worse in my lifetime. Once it was very much the fact that middle class people had access, working class people didn't really have access to lawyers or the money to spend on lawyers. Middle class people tended to be able to go to a lawyer to get a will done or to get advice. And these days, most of the middle class are ruled out of access to the justice. And this is a question for within the law and the legal profession to grapple with, but it's also for us as people who are outside the law to actually comment on as well. I mean, do we want to live in a society where there's a narrow group of people who are poor enough to qualify for legal aid, and then only in very limited circumstances, and then we've got the very, very rich and corporations who can afford access to the law? And you probably just heard my computer restart Outlook. Very thoughtful of it to do that, and to throw me off my thought chain. Okay, we've got people who are in the very, very low economic status who have notional access to legal aid or support through community legal centres. We've got the very, very wealthy and the corporate interests who have reasonably free access to lawyers, and everyone else is just left out of the picture. And that's where we sit at the moment, and that's a great concern to people in the law and outside the law as well. All right. What else have we got as some basic concepts? Yes, polyvocalism. This is something else I want to bring in as an idea, and this is connected to the idea of equality. It is connected to the idea of what it means to have voice, what it means to be heard. And the idea of polyvocalism is multiple voices. Do we live in a society where everyone can be heard? Everyone is treated equally in that their opinion, their voice, their point of view is respected. Doesn't have to be agreed with. I mean, this is not the same as saying it has the right to their opinion, and therefore everyone's equal, because some opinions are clearly ill-formed. Some opinions clearly harm other people. So saying, well, I'm a racist and that's my opinion and I have a right to my opinion, doesn't really cut it in a society where that's based on equality and respect. However, the person who is, even that person has the right to their voice, and the right to be respected, so long as they use that voice in a way that doesn't directly harm other people. So it's not easy. It's not an easy kind of a concept, this polyvocalism, but what the next question it leads us to is, whose voice does the justice system speak in? Does it speak in everyone's voice? Is it a choir of all voices united speaking? And think about that choir analogy as well. Like, you've got different sorts of voices who all fill out different ranges of the frequency, of the musical frequency, but all work together in a harmonious way. Or do we have a system that speaks in the voice, say, of the privileged, the voice of the wealthy, the voice of institutions, and then pretends it's the voice of everyone? So it's our justice system, it's our courts of the people of the land, but that's just a facade for behind which we actually have very much vested interest speaking. We have ingrained discrimination. We have systemic violence in the system that is obscured by this sort of idea that the system speaks in everyone's voice and speaks for all. So again, this is one of those concepts that we're not going to get to the bottom of in 10 weeks of learning modules, but I want to introduce it now right at the start, because we are thinking about multiple and decentered concepts of justice. We're going to be, over the next 10 weeks, looking at a lot of different ideas around what justice is and what it means. And I don't want to be in the situation where you feel as though you need to pick the right one or the correct one or the one that's for you. It's a bit like musical taste, really. Some people are quite content to be heavy metal fans or country fans or whatever. But there are plenty of people who like different types of music, who like music that overlaps and music that there's a fusion of different ideas. Same thing with justice. I'm not going to be expecting you to go, that's it, I'm a rules-oriented person and that's the only way that I'll perceive justice. We need to be able to look at justice again, returning to the theme of this particular talk, justice in place. Where am I now? Where am I situated physically in society? Where am I sitting socially within social structures? And what does that mean for my experiences of justice and injustice? And how then can I step outside my position and look at others' positions and understand their perspectives and appreciate it? And what my hope is, well, pretty much fundamental hope for this unit, is that it will give you tools to start asking questions about those different perspectives, but will also provide you with a common language that you can talk about these things. So, you may not have, and let's face it, most people don't know the difference between deontological and teleological ethics, because our grasp of ancient Greek is not what it once was. But now we have those terms. When we say someone is talking about, or you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, what position they're arguing from. You've got a label you can use, and you can use that in discussion that gives you common ground when you're talking with other people. So it's not just a matter of being able to appreciate different positions. It's also the ability to have a critical language where you can actually discuss and evaluate those different positions. Because one position I'm definitely not arguing from is that equality is important, but equality doesn't mean that everything's the same. Equality doesn't mean that everything is equally valid, or everyone is equally good, or everyone is equally virtuous, or everyone is entitled to do whatever harm to others because it's their right to do whatever they want. We need to move beyond those very simplistic ideas of what equality is, and to have those discussions and debates in ways that we can share ideas. Free speech is one of those ones that's come up in recent years. It's always been a problem, let's face it. We can go back to the Enlightenment and we've got issues. We go back to the medieval era, we've got issues of what free speech is and who should be able to say what. It's nothing new. But we are seeing increasingly reductive sides where we've got one camp saying free speech is absolute, I should be able to say whatever I want, whenever I want, and an opposing camp that says you shouldn't exercise speech in a way that offends anyone else or harms anyone else or anyone else doesn't like. And everyone has to learn the rules of what everyone thinks is appropriate or inappropriate to talk about. And those two camps are just not talking to each other. They're just talking at each other. They're not using a common language. They're not negotiating. They're not looking at the nuance of the particular issue. They're just forming these positions and saying, I'm pro free speech. I'm pro. Well, people don't say they're anti-free speech, but they say, I'm anti-hate speech. And then sometimes some people have a very clear idea of what hate speech is, but some people then, on the other hand, have this kind of fairly flexible sort of, well, hate speech is anything I don't like kind of approach. And that's often doesn't feel problematic if you agree with the politics of the person who's saying that, but it becomes very odious very quickly if you don't agree with those politics. So, if someone says, I don't think you should be able to say that because it's offensive, if they're saying it's offensive because they're a religious person and they think it's immoral, it's a very different proposition to there's someone who thinks that it's a political statement that harms the feelings of other people in an abstract sense. But both can feel equally offended or feel that people are being offended. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the weeds of the free speech debate here. And it's something that we can bring up again in workshops if you want to talk more about. But I think it's a good practical example of the kinds of tool set that this course will be helping you towards, in being able to not just sit in one of these oppositional camps and shout at each other, but actually try and work practically towards solutions. All right, this is pretty much most of what I had to say in the notes for this week. We're going to have a fairly ease into the workshops next week. In the meantime, Teams is your friend in terms of discussions, questions, and so forth. It's supposed to be set up automatically for you for each of your units. It hasn't happened for this unit, but it's not a big deal. All you have to do is log into Teams, log into Moodle, find the link to get into Teams, and then that'll send me a link to authorize you to join the team. Sorry, it's an extra step that we shouldn't have to do, but I figured it was easier than trying to wait for ITS to fix the problem. And it just means you have to wait a little while for me to get the message to log you in so that you can get in a look. But anyway, Teams, if you haven't used it before, is basically like a private social media network. And you can post things, share things, discuss things, and it really is the best tool for keeping discussions going. And you're free to email me and make time to see me as well. But generally, if you've got a question, it'll mean that other people have that question too. So having that discussion via Teams is generally a much better way of dealing with it than everyone in the class emailing me individually, and then it takes time for me to get back to everyone. I'm sure that makes sense. Anyway, I hope that little rambling talk has got you enthused for this subject, and we'll have plenty of time coming up to talk about it more. Nice to meet you all.